Hello, everyone. My name is Thomas. I'm a musicologist, and let's get to it. Okay, so in recent years, musicology has seen a surge of interest in the occult, particularly in the occult sides of modernism. As pointed out in the 2018 special issue of Journal of Musicological Research on music and the occult, this topic is likely to raise some eyebrows within musicology, which has historically often felt embarrassed by the occult, felt uncomfortable by the way it challenges the foundation of a more or less positivist rationality, or simply found it unimportant. In this regard, musicology's relation to esotericism is no different than in other branches of Western academia, as demonstrated, for example, in this book by Wouter Hanegraaff. Within Danish musicology, however, this new surge seems not to have caught on yet. In this paper, I will argue that there is good reason for it to do so. In late 19th century and early 20th century Danish art music, there were several composers who were, in fact, influenced by different branches of esotericism, especially Theosophy, in different ways. Some of them composed works with a specific program, drawing explicitly on esoteric subjects. Some of them authored elaborate, but usually unpublished, music theoretical treatises in which they expressed their esoteric musical ontologies. Others, again, were members of esoteric societies, while any influence this might have had on their music remains an under-researched open question. My paper is divided into three parts. First, I briefly make the argument that one reason that Danish musicology has not yet turned to the esoteric current running in fin de siècle music is that this current has been overshadowed by the current of symbolism, which has gained a lot of academic interest from musicologists. However, I will argue that the term symbolism, while accurate at times, does not fully capture what I will be talking about today. Second, I present these four Danish composers who were, each in their own way, inspired or influenced by esoteric currents in their compositional output. And third, I will zoom in on one of these composers, the recently rediscovered composer Tekla Griebel Wandall, and her treatise Microcosm of Tones, which is written on a Theosophical foundation. And before I begin on these three steps, I just want to mention that this is an idea for a research project that has not been realized yet. So this is not, I can't make any full conclusions yet. I have a lot of questions. So any suggestions you might have are very, very welcome. First, I will, as mentioned, discuss symbolism. And symbolism has been a hugely important term for Danish music historiography, not least because it is directly relevant for the Danish composer who has undoubtedly received the most attention, namely Carl Nielsen. Symbolism can be used as an accurate label, but it can also be used as a label which allows one to acknowledge a certain spirituality in a composer's worldview or music, without one having to actually dive into what this might entail. But the occult modernism that influenced Danish music went beyond a general symbolism and included specific, elaborate ideas acknowledging the mysterious workings of otherworldly powers. In Denmark, Johannes Jørgensen was perhaps the key figure of symbolism together with for example, Sophus Clausen, and scholars often look to his writings for an authoritative description of what symbolism is. And his writings make it quite clear that his brand of symbolism did not fully embrace all kinds of the occult. As Jørgensen began turning towards Catholicism, he also distanced himself from esoteric currents. For instance, while he acknowledged what Schopenhauer called man's need for metaphysics, he found that this need had been exploited in theosophy as well as in, and I quote, mesmerism, animal magnetism, clairvoyance, somnambulism, Rosicrucianism, Illuminati, false prophets, and swindlers. And this is from his review of August Strindberg's novel Inferno. And later in that review, he also calls Madame Blavatsky a phony. Yeah. So symbolism is a broad and many-faceted term, but clearly it doesn't necessarily embrace all kinds of esotericism and occultism. The influence of the term symbolism has not only meant that it can be used to quickly gloss over some of this difficult spirituality. It has also meant that composers whose worldviews and music were directly heavily and explicitly influenced by Theosophy or other branches of esotericism, have all been collated together under this umbrella of symbolism. And in these cases, I think symbolism is a euphemism. Okay, I now move on to present 4 Danish composers whose compositional outputs deserve to be put into a new context, namely the context of occult modernism. And I will begin chronologically by birth year with this guy called, we say Louis Glass in Danish, Louis Glass in I guess you'd say in English. He's not very well known today, but around the turn of the century, he was perhaps the most serious competitor to Carl Nielsen in terms of popularity. He was one of the great symphonists of his generation, and he composed in a wide range of genres, including 6 symphonies, for example. And Glass was an active member in Danish societies around Theosophy and the Star in the East. He was also deeply interested and invested in the cosmology of Martinus. For example, in a 1933 issue of the journal Cosmos, he wrote a heartfelt recommendation of Martinus' Livets Bog, Book of Life. And there's very little research on Louis Glass. There's a Danish scholar, Claus Rølum Larsen, who's been working on a biography for decades. Hopefully it will see the light of day soon. But therefore, there's also very little knowledge on exactly how Theosophy and Martinus' cosmology, and perhaps other currents, might have influenced his music. But we know for a fact that it did influence it in some way. Most notably, Glass wrote the symphony, his symphony number 5 is called Svastika. He wrote it in 1919 to 20, so that was before the swastika meant something else. At this point, it's still primarily a symbol for the wheel of life. Exactly how this work and other of his works makes music out of the wheel of life remains an open question, however, that musicologists haven't really dared to ask. But I think it's time that the title is taken seriously and that the work is analyzed on the premises it sets forth. And he's one of the few composers I have with me today whose music is recorded. So let's hear some of the second movement from this 5th symphony called Sinfonia Svastika. About what we have the time for today. Yeah, wonderful music, I think. The melody and the harmony in the ending is exactly the same as in the introduction to the popular Danish TV series Rejseholdet. I just wanted to mention that. I don't think there's any relation, but okay. The second composer I will highlight is Tekla Griebel Wandall. And if you ask me, she's one of the best kept secret in Danish music history, but I'm very biased, because I've been researching her for the past 5 years and I've written a book about her. She had remarkable success in the 1890s. She was the first woman to have an opera performed at the Royal Danish Theatre in 1899. And following what seems to have been a birth depression around 1904, however, she became less prolific and began fading into almost complete oblivion. So she has only been rediscovered in recent years. But she wrote the treatise Microcosm of Tones, which I will turn to in the third part of my paper. So for now, I'll move on to the next composer, namely Ludolf Nielsen. And this other Nielsen, as he's sometimes called, suffered a destiny very much like the aforementioned Louis Glass and Tekla Griebel Wandall. His music was deemed too romantic and backwards-looking. Ludolf Nielsen wrote music for the Masonic Lodge he was part of. He also wrote a gargantuan work for orchestra and choir called The Tower of Babel, which was supposed to be his vision of a new world order with peace and harmony between people. Ironically, he finished that work in the same month as World War I broke out, and that led him into a serious depression, after which he stopped writing this kind of spiritual Weltanschauungsmusik. Lastly, I must mention Rued Langgaard. Now, if you know Rued Langgaard, you will know that he's very difficult to get a hold on. Throughout his life, he was invested in many different esoteric branches, and numerous of his works are explicitly informed by them. And to mention just one, I included this work here called The Star in the East. He retitled that later, though. But still, he's one of the composers caught under the umbrella of symbolism very often. Furthermore, he's been described as a loner, an eccentric outsider, and many sources confirm that that was indeed how he was seen by many of his contemporaries. But he was not just a loner standing outside of any context. I think there's reason to inscribe him into the context of the never really disenchanted modernity that his oeuvre very much encapsulates. And there's possibly many more Danish composers with esoteric leanings that deserve to be included here. But I'll now turn to this part 3 and discuss this music theoretical treatise by Tekla Griebel Wandall. And as you can see, there are 2 surviving manuscripts of this from 36 and 39. They differ slightly from each other. And letters from the composer suggest that she had been working on this theory since at least 1917, possibly already since 1899. And the best way, I think, to give a glimpse of this very fascinating treatise and its peculiar tone of voice is to cite at length its opening paragraphs. So here they are. Our soul sits in its residence and looks out through the 5 windows, or however many senses we may have. It is not a lot of windows, and hence it perceives only little of cosmos, but a nice little view from each window is there nonetheless. The 2 called sight and hearing even have a rather wide view, an entire revelation for the attentive spirit. What do we see then? What do we hear? Among other things, we see and hear that which reflect the cosmos, even if the format is small. We see and hear eternal truths, a little of that esoteric wisdom which exists in all religions and which, it seems, would persist even if all religions vanished. Now, first and foremost, we see and hear the one manifesting itself in 3. It is the white light with its 3 immanent colors, red, yellow, blue. It is the tone with its immanent 3 tones, the triad of cosmos. It is a triangle and a triad, for we see them through 2 different windows. If our spirit stood free outside its residence, would they be one? What do I know? So, a very unusual introduction to a Western harmony treatise from the 1930s, to be sure. But she proceeds to focus especially on 2 things. First, the connection between colors and tones, which you can get a glimpse of here. And there's an obvious parallel here to Scriabin, who is famous both for his synesthesia and his belief in theosophy. But Griebel makes no mention of Scriabin, and she also makes it explicit that she does not have synesthesia. This is just the way things are interconnected, according to her reading of theosophy. And by the way, it seems that she had been reading the many Danish translations of Annie Besant's works rather than Blavatsky's works. Second of all, Griebel presents Theosophy's so-called septenary principles. I'm sure many of you know, but it's a fundamental dictum in Theosophy according to which man and cosmos is divided into 3 higher and 4 lower principles, listed here. Griebel posits that the septenary principle is the foundation for music as well. The root is like the white light, which manifests itself in the first 3 different tones in the overtone series, which combine into the major triad, and which correspond to the 3 higher principles listed here. And combined with the 4 subordinate tones corresponding to the 4 lower principles, this aggregate creates the natural scale, which in her theory is not the usual major scale, but very unusually, the Mixolydian scale, because something close to the minor seventh appears in the overtone series. And I know I'm getting a bit technical now, but when I present this stuff at music theory conferences, this is where people get all excited, because usually it's not the Mixolydian scale you have as sort of the foundation for your music theory. In other words, music is a microcosm of tones, according to her, because it is a sounding glimpse of the septenary principle which guides cosmos. Her use of the overtone series is very reminiscent of large parts of music theory history dating all the way back to ancient Greece, but her project is explicitly one of gnosis, one of knowing and experiencing the true order of macro and microcosm. Much of her microcosm of tones is devoted to a peculiar sort of affect theory or affektenlære, in which she presents how different scale degrees, intervals, and chords signify different affects. And you can see that here, it's all in Danish, of course, but you can see that she calls the root home tone or resting tone. The fifth is the youth tone, and the third is the waiting tone. The seventh is the tone of remorse, and so on. And she also discusses the affective qualities of intervals in different directions. So if you have a movement from flat sixth to fifth, it represents anxiety, torment, coldness, darkness, and so on. Griebel underlines that her theory is not a mechanistic tool for composition. Instead, she explains, I think that for any tone poet who is in contact with the movement of cosmos, these musical expressions will come by themselves from the inside. In case he is not in contact, his production will become more or less chaotic. And she does write he and his here, by the way. So the true genius for Griebel is willingly or not attuned to the septenary principle of man and cosmos. And the microcosm of tones will vibrate the affects embedded in macrocosm, much like earlier 18th century music theorists believed that music would vibrate the nerves of the human body. In consequence, absolute music, that is instrumental music that only refers to itself, is never fully absolute in her view. In Griebel's view, music will always express extra musical affects. One obvious question is what this musical ontology meant for Griebel's own compositional practice. And first of all, I think it explains why she had little interest in absolute musical forms, such as sonatas or symphonies. Almost all of her more than 100 works, which have survived until today, are dramatic stage music, vocal music, programmatic, or unmistakably narrative instrumental music. Second, her philosophy of music also explains why she is stuck to tonal idioms even after her experiments with atonality and impressionistic music. And she explains this herself. For many years, I have been deeply captivated by modern music, and I have used its sounds myself. But the superiority of the triad in the universe is and stays what it always was. It is an eternal truth. And her poetics and musical ontology leads her to conclude the treatise with the following words on modern music. It's possible that the fully modern music is able to detach itself from the spiral of cosmos. By all means, just let it do so. It is simply searching for Wunderdinge, von denen man nie geträumt hat, as Mendelssohn says of Chopin's music. Later, when it reunites itself with the spiral of cosmos, it will result in something so wonderful that we have never dreamt of it. So as is evident, modern music is not a bad thing for Griebel, but it is a detour from the order of cosmos and from the eternal truth to which true tonal music is attuned, in her view. Okay, one might conclude that Griebel's esotericism, and by extension possibly also that of Louis Glass, Ludolf Nielsen, and Rued Langgaard, was both a private affair and something also clearly born out of modernism's re-enchanting revival of the occult. A revival that extended modernism's scientific worldview into the great beyond. At the same time, the parallels between Griebel's musical ontology and common romantic ideas about music are obvious. Perhaps one could say that esotericism provided a mode through which one could promulgate a romantic worldview and romantic music in a new way that corresponded with modernism. Ultimately, I think there's reason to ask whether these four composers who have all been criticized for writing romantic music at the wrong time in history were really always as outdated as we are sometimes told. Or did they, in other, more well-hidden and occult ways, interact with the diverse facets of modernism? And these would be questions for a larger research project, but I think there are some interesting questions here for Danish musicology. Yeah, thank you.